Thank you very much for coming. My name's Krista Woodley and I'm a senior learning designer at Brightwave, and today with my colleague James Corey-Wright, who's our head of learning design, we're going to be talking about a question of content. And I suppose that question really is, how can content best support learners' learning and performance in the workplace? So I'll just hand over to James to kick us off.
Hello everyone. I have to apologise for my croaky voice in advance. I hardly can speak at all, so therefore I'm going to do the next 10 minutes as a series of charades. So that's just to check that you're all on the ball. In talking about content, I suppose it's stating the obvious really, but every second of every minute of every day, data or information or content, if you like, is being created and distributed throughout the world. I mean, just these stats are already basically out of date. So the situation as we find it now is never ever has there been so much information. And in fact, a large amount of it is being created by users rather than by corporates. And I would draw particular attention to video there. Video is a really good example of the sort of information explosion or content explosion. If you want to learn about anything nowadays, you can pretty much go onto the internet and look for, say, a video on YouTube and find out how to do whatever it is you want to do. That includes even, learning how to use software. And it's strange, but you go and see a video of someone using the software, and so video is a very important aspect of that. And it's no coincidence that video is, because it's cheaper and easier. It's a really good example of how things are cheaper and easier to publish and to distribute. So basically, technology is the thing that's also making all this possible. I think the main thing with technical innovation is obviously it's the explosion in mobile. I was looking for some stats last night, especially I was thinking smartphones is a really good example. In 2012, they reckon that 50% of people in the UK, all ages, now own a smartphone, and 18 to 34-year-olds, that's around 70% ownership. So, it's pretty extraordinary. And this kind of mass ownership of the technology is what's helping to drive work and life together, because, for obvious reasons, now everyone has the power to consume online learning from a mobile device. So this is a really great opportunity, really, because basically it's an opportunity to deliver all these sorts of things that I assume everybody would want to wish for in projecting learning through the workplace. The question is, the technology is one thing, but how can content, how is this an opportunity to deliver the right content to enable people to learn and improve their performance at work? In the past, perhaps we've tended to think of content as very much a kind of one-off thing. So in training terms, we've tended to think about getting a load of content together and then creating a one-off course or a series of modules, that all of which had to be created from scratch. But I think really that the starting point for the way we look at content nowadays really has to change, and we have to sort of take note of what I've just been talking about, really, in the sense that change the entire way of sort of thinking about content. If you've got to train people, people need to learn about something, perhaps we can assume now that 80%, it's only a rule of thumb, the 80-20 thing, but 80% of the content that we need probably already exists in one form or another. And perhaps we only actually, whenever we're delivering some sort of training in something, only really need to create 20% now from scratch, brand new. And it's a case of tapping into the 80. And also, of course, not only that, but of course content is being generated all the time, peer-to-peer, through social media and through the internet. So if we accept that is basically one sort of way of looking at content. I suppose another way of expressing that is that it really, organisations need to possibly change a bit from even where they are now in order to take advantage of that. And the only way you can do that is basically if they start to accept that basically useful content does exist outside the organisation as well as inside it. And this isn't necessarily the case as we stand here now. Most organisations believe that all the content that they need to use for their training must come from within the organisation and has to be 100% correct, branded and exact. Is that necessarily the case? I don't know. Also, I think that organisations need to embrace the idea that formal and informal learning, in the sense that people can they can learn in a self-directed way. Might have formal assessments, but how they get to the assessments can be an informal experience. And the same goes for embracing. Organisations need to embrace the use of all the devices and all the channels that are out there. But all the content in the world is, that's all very well, but when it comes to the workplace, learning in the workplace, it's only any use if it's useful, relevant, trustworthy, and up to date. And otherwise, it's just we have the problem that we often do have now, which is information overload. So all the content, there's a lot of content that is no use. So we need to kind of narrow that down as to what's really helpful. And the question is, who decides what is useful, what's helpful, what's going to help people improve their performance at work? And do we need to possibly curate that content, therefore? So if there's a lot of content out there, do we need somebody or people to pull the appropriate content together, to sort it out and sift it, fine-tune it, and then possibly to create the missing bits that need to be created from scratch? In an ideal world, the answer to the previous question was no. Cream rises to the top. There are lots of sites on the internet which prove that, in fact, these things can become self-perpetuating in a good way. TripAdvisor comes to mind. Wikipedia is another example. Basically, it's peer-generated, it's self-perpetuating, it's self-regulated. We don't know whether it's 100% accurate, but it's 99%, and it seems to work. And also, of course, there's really good sites where technical people often go to post up queries, and then their kind of peer group answers the query, and then they rate the advice they were given, and those sort of people become gurus, basically. And in the end, we'd like to think that maybe online learning will become like that, where it won't need curation, in fact. However, we're not there yet. We're not there by a long chalk. So we're at the very start of this thing. So I think there's a strong thing that we do need content to be curated. So I'm going to hand over to Krista now, who's going to talk through her current thinking on how that might be carried out.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you a quick look at Tesselo, which is Brightwave's new web-based learning service, which helps people to take more control of their learning in the workplace, and which really brings out that aspect of keeping things relevant and up-to-date and peer-generated that James was just talking about. So as you can see, it's got a variety of different elements on the home page. You can see the green panel is the My Learning panel, which is where the core mandatory learning would be. You can see the grey elements on the right are where different resources can be updated and uploaded to keep things constantly updated. Underneath there's a shared space where people can share things that they've discovered for themselves. There's a leaderboard in the centre at the bottom where people can compete to gain more and more points by doing quizzes and by gaining points on different pieces of learning they've done. And you can see that there's an area on the bottom left that tells you the different items that are trending on the site. So if we go into My Experiences, this uses the Tin Can Experience API to allow learners to record and share the different learning events and experiences that they go through in their daily work. So for example, as a learning designer, if I went to somebody's blog about design and I saw something that I thought was particularly useful or particularly current, I could log that as part of my own training record, but I could also share that with other learners. And this is an example of the brand knowledge area, which is simply a resources area where the organisation or the supplier can upload and keep updating different pieces of useful learning information. So that's just a very quick look at Teslo. Obviously, if you want to see more of it or have a play around with it, you can go and look at it on the Brightwave stand. So, as James was saying earlier, you can see from Teslo that the learning is kept alive. It's kept constantly updated in order to make it relevant. So, it's worth asking, how could this work in practical terms? Who and how does this curation process work? So, just to return to James's point that content enables and enhances work performance best when it's useful, relevant, trustworthy, and kept up to date and constantly changing in order to meet individuals' needs, communities' needs, and business needs. So in terms of the actual people, who does what, the kind of approach that we recommend at Brightwave is that you have 2 curators as part of a curation team. On the supplier side, for example, at Brightwave, you would have somebody like a learning designer, somebody who has the skill set that's required to think about the learning, how to shape the learning, what needs to be introduced, what needs to be changed. And on the client side, you would have somebody, for example, somebody from L&D, a project manager, or a subject matter expert, somebody who has a similar skill set to decide what it is that the organisation needs. So the idea really that's at the middle of this is this idea of the virtuous spiral, where people's performance and learning is constantly tailored and fine-tuned and continuously changing to improve. So to support this continuous virtuous spiral, we're suggesting this three-step curation process. So we've looked at the learning in terms of the things that I showed you on Teslo. Those are the ideal kind of things that we would recommend as part of the learning. And then there's a feedback step, which feeds into the curation, which then feeds back into the learning. So the kind of things that would come out of the feedback, once people have done the learning, or once people have been into the learning, you would get things like feedback out of the learning analytics. So you would get feedback about which parts of the learning, which events and activities and objects people are finding useful, which people are visiting, which people aren't visiting. You would get user feedback, so you might ask, for example, for surveys. You would be able to get feedback on performance levels, and they might be levels of a team or community, or again, they might be against business measures. So you might see how your business is performing. For example, if you felt that your sales team weren't really hitting the mark on selling a particular product stream, then you might add some learning about that to make sure that they have enough information to sell that properly. And also you might use anecdotal feedback, word of mouth stuff that you hear, to feed into the curation in order to change and update the learning. So in terms of that curation team, the curator on the supplier side and the curator on the client side, those curation activities would be firstly to analyse that data and the feedback that comes out, then to get together and consult about what's the best plan of action, what you need to change, what you need to keep, and then to take action on those decisions really and to refine the learning. So in terms of refining, I guess what we're talking about is editing in various forms the existing content and creating new content. So the curators or the curation team would need to decide which pieces they want to delete, if they want to create or add new things, or if they want to add new pieces to existing pieces. For example, you might have a PowerPoint on a certain subject and you want to add a piece of video to it. So you could just adapt things that already exist within the learning. So you would be updating and also reprioritizing. For example, if you had an induction portal for people, and you had, for example, you had an information security breach in your organization, and you already had some information security information on there, information security stuff, you might want to bring that to a more prominent place in the site. If you thought that it was a current issue, you could move things around the site to make it more relevant. And then the final step to that 4-step part of the curation would obviously be to push and promote those changes. It's all very well to put a lot of work into creating something that's up to date, but you need to let people know that they need to continuously revisit your site by marketing and publicity. So in this way, curation will help towards that ideal of content becoming peer-generated, peer-regulated, and peer-perpetuated as you encourage and support your learners to contribute. So just to sum up, these are the 5 content considerations, and let me just run through them. So the first one is this 80-20 approach that we're suggesting about using 80% existing content and 20% new created content. There's the consideration of using a balance of formal and informal learning and using all of the devices and channels that are available and appropriate to your learners. If you know that 90% of people in your organisation or 100% of people in your organisation have a smart device, then use that and make use of that. Another consideration is the curator and client-curator relationship and who best in your organisation would fit that role. To think about achieving this virtuous spiral of continuous fine-tuning with the analyse, consult, refine and push and promote steps. And of course, all the while bearing in mind a clear vision and goals for your organisation. So, that's everything. Thank you very much for your time. Does anybody have any questions? As I mentioned earlier, if anybody wants to play around with Tesselo or have more of a look at it, then you come to the Brightwave stand. Excellent. Thank you very much.